I found the letter tucked into a false bottom of my late husband's old wooden cigar box, the one my son tossed onto the curb outside the flower shop like a piece of garbage. Its last page, in my husband's careful, deliberate script, read, "If you're reading this, our son has already tried to destroy you. Do not trust him. Save yourself." I didn't know then that the chain of events already in motion would end with a $210,000 judgment, a real estate license in shreds, and a forgery charge that sent my daughter-in-law to prison for 18 months. But I knew, standing there in my house slippers on a cold October afternoon, that the real fight had just begun. My name is Alina. I'm 53 years old, and before I became a small business owner, I spent 28 years as a registered nurse in a cardiac telemetry unit. That career taught me how to read subtle changes in data, how to notice when a number doesn't look right, and how to stay calm while everyone around you is panicking. It also made me the family's unofficial bookkeeper, because my late husband, Daniel, was a brilliant architect who could sketch a roofline from memory, but could not balance a checkbook to save his life. Daniel passed 7 years ago from an aortic aneurysm that hit without warning, and he left me his pension, a quiet little house with a sagging back porch, and a trust he'd structured so carefully that even I didn't fully understand its locks until it was nearly too late. For years, I managed everything alone, filing my own taxes, tracking every receipt, and I thought I was finally handing off some of that burden when my son Marcus married Tanya. The florist shop was supposed to be our fresh start. Marcus had always loved arranging flowers, a talent he discovered working summers at a garden center, and Tanya had a head for business, or so I believed. She was already a licensed real estate agent, sharp and persuasive, the kind of person who could sell sand in a desert. When they came to me with a detailed business plan for an upscale floral design studio that would serve weddings and corporate clients, with glossy projections and a mock-up of the website, I emptied my widow's pension fund, all $175,000 of it, and poured it into Bloom and Vine. We shook hands in my kitchen. They would own 60% between them, I would hold 40%, and we'd split profits once the loan was repaid. No contract, no notary, because they were family, and I was too trusting to imagine otherwise. That handshake would become the most expensive mistake of my life. For the first 8 months, the shop seemed to thrive. The website went live with glossy photos of Tanya smiling in front of $1,000 bridal arches, the social media feeds filled with 5-star reviews, and every month the sales reports Marcus emailed me showed steady growth. I was proud and uninvolved, a silent partner in name only. Then, on a Tuesday in late October, I got a call from a wholesale flower vendor, a man named Carl who'd been supplying roses for our wedding contracts, and his voice was strained. He hadn't been paid in 6 weeks, despite repeated invoices, and now he was holding a shipment of Dutch tulips that he refused to deliver until the balance was cleared. 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed with an email from the commercial landlord, a company called Paragon Properties, and the subject line read, "Final notice, eviction for non-payment." 3 months of rent, totaling $11,400, remained unpaid, and they had already filed a forcible entry and detainer complaint. My heart kicked into a rhythm I recognized from Code Blues, fast and shallow, and I drove to the shop with my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles whitened. The storefront on Maple Avenue looked different even before I got out of the car. The window boxes, which Marcus had planted with cascading ivy and purple petunias, were stripped bare, and the hand-painted Bloom and Vine sign that had hung above the door was gone, leaving 4 small holes in the brick. I tried my key in the lock, but the key wouldn't turn. The cylinder had been swapped for a new Schlage deadbolt I didn't recognize. Through the glass, I saw bare concrete floors, where the refrigerated display cases used to be, empty shelves with scattered potting soil, the computer gone from the front counter, and a single wilted lily stem lying in the corner like a punctuation mark. Taped to the front door was a single sheet of paper with Tanya's handwriting, black ink on a torn legal pad page. "I can't do this anymore. The divorce is final. I'm sorry." Below it, a photocopy of a petition for dissolution of marriage, stamped that very morning by the county clerk. I stood there reading it 4 times, my fingers on the cold glass, and I could feel the blood draining from my face. My entire retirement, my 40%, the $175,000, all of it, gone into an empty shell. The loss hit me in the chest like a silent code blue, the kind where the monitor still shows a faint rhythm but the patient is already dead. I called Marcus and he answered on the second ring, his voice cracking like he'd been crying for hours. "Mom, she cleaned out the business account last night. I didn't know, I swear I didn't know." I believed him. I wanted to believe him. That's what a mother does, and that's what the vultures count on. Within that same day, the vultures circled. Marcus arrived at my house that evening, not alone. Tanya was with him, dry-eyed and dressed in a cream-colored cashmere coat, a clipboard under her arm. Suddenly, the divorce wasn't final. Suddenly, it was a misunderstanding, and they were here to manage the situation. Tanya sat me down at my own kitchen table and started talking about liability. Creditors would come after the shop's assets, she explained, and since my name was on the LLC paperwork as a member, they'd come after me personally. The best thing, the only way to protect myself, was to sign a document giving Marcus power of attorney so they could negotiate with the bank on my behalf. She had already drafted it. She slid a pen across the table. I looked at my son, who was staring at the floor, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach, a patient about to crash and no one else reading the monitor. I played the part of the overwhelmed widow, too distraught to make decisions, and I told them I needed a few days to think. That wasn't good enough for Tanya, who suggested I move into their guest room temporarily, just until things settle, because it wasn't safe for me to be alone with all this stress. Within 48 hours, my house was listed as vacant, and I was installed in a pale lavender bedroom at their 2-story condo, my suitcase barely unpacked before Tanya started pushing the power of attorney again. Marcus hovered in the doorway, nodded whenever she spoke, and avoided my eyes. On moving day, I watched them clear my house. They packed what they wanted, left the rest for a charity pickup, and Tanya personally tossed a small stack of Daniel's belongings into the trash bin at the curb. His leather address book, a bronze desk clock I'd given him on our 15th anniversary, and the cigar box he'd kept on his nightstand for every year of our marriage. "Moldy old junk," she said, dusting off her hands. I waited until their car pulled away, then I walked down the driveway in my house slippers and fished the box out of the trash. The wood was still warm from the sun, the brass hinges rough with age. Inside were a few old cigar bands and a photograph of the two of us at the Grand Canyon, but when I pressed the velvet lining, I felt a seam. Beneath it, folded into a tiny square, was a letter in Daniel's handwriting, dated 6 months before he died. The title page just said Aliner, but on the last sheet was the warning that changed everything. "If you're reading this, our son has already tried to destroy you. Do not trust him. Save yourself." I sat on the edge of the guest bed and read that letter 3 times before I folded it into my bra and started planning. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that true family loyalty never asks you to sign away your dignity. Now I'll tell you exactly how I unraveled what they had really done. Over the next 2 weeks, I became a model of confused gratitude. I let Tanya micromanage my meals, my medications, my phone calls, and I nodded vacantly whenever she brought up the power of attorney. She presented the document again at breakfast one morning, sliding it next to my oatmeal with a pen already uncapped, and I let my hand tremble so badly that I dropped the pen. I don't know what this is," I said, blinking slowly. "Marcus will explain," she cooed, but Marcus was in the living room watching a game, his back to me. I watched her jaw tighten. She needed my signature, and she needed it soon because the creditors were circling the LLC, and she had already guaranteed some of those debts using my forged signature as a co-signer. I didn't know that last part at the time, but I was about to find out. The pressure intensified. Tanya arranged a doctor's appointment to assess my cognitive state, framing it as concern. The neurologist was a young man with kind eyes and a list of standard questions. He asked the date, the current president, the name of the hospital where I'd worked. I gave wrong answers deliberately, mixing up years, calling the president by a predecessor's name, and I leaned forward to whisper, "I think they are trying to steal my house." The doctor's expression flickered with genuine unease. Tanya quickly interjected that I'd been paranoid lately and exhausted from the move. He flagged me for follow-up testing and possible conservatorship evaluation, which bought me more time because now Tanya believed I was genuinely declining, and she just had to wait for the medical documentation to catch up. She left that appointment practically humming with satisfaction, and I shuffled behind her like a lost lamb, counting the steps to my next move. Meanwhile, I watched. Their financial life was a disaster hidden under quartz countertops and leased German sedans. Tanya's real estate commissions were irregular, and Marcus wasn't working at all. Yet I saw deliveries of new furniture every week, a closet full of designer bags, and a wine fridge stocked with bottles that cost more than my first car. At night, I could hear Tanya on the phone in the office next door, voice low and sharp. I'd press my ear to the thin wall and hold my breath. She was talking to a creditor, and I caught the phrase, "The old lady signs next week," and I told you the account is still frozen. I started keeping notes on a tiny pad I hid inside the lining of my coat, a habit from charting irregular vitals. She used the word flag 11 times in one call. I counted because I had a nurse's instinct for tracking irregular data points, and 11 was a red flag in any clinical context. A few days later, I heard her on another call, this time more frantic, saying the offshore transfer needs to clear by Friday, and if the bank asks, you're a flower supplier in the islands. I wrote that down too. One afternoon, I found the first piece of physical evidence. Tanya and Marcus had gone out for a few hours, and I wandered into the kitchen to make tea. The recycling bin next to the pantry was overflowing, and as I nudged it with my foot, a stack of crumpled papers caught my eye. Not shredded, just balled up. I flattened them on the counter. They were bank statements from Bloom and Vine's business account, 6 months of transaction histories printed on that thin thermal paper that fades in sunlight. I lined them up in chronological order like a medication reconciliation chart, and I started reading. The business account, held at a regional bank called Great Lakes Commercial, had started with a healthy balance of $42,000 after the initial inventory purchase. And for the first several months, the deposits matched the revenue Marcus had been reporting. But then I noticed a pattern. Beginning in month 4, a series of outgoing wire transfers labeled vendor payment tropicals to an account number that didn't match any of our known suppliers. The amounts were always just under the $10,000 mandatory reporting threshold, $9,200 here, $8,700 there, a classic structuring tactic to avoid triggering a currency transaction report or a suspicious activity report. I traced each one with my finger, 12 transfers over 8 weeks, totaling nearly $98,000. The destination was a 9-digit account number with a routing number that started with a Caribbean banking code. I knew enough about financial regulations from nursing, where we dealt with insurance fraud investigations, to recognize that a domestic flower shop had no reason to pay a vendor in the Cayman Islands. I photographed each page with my phone, smoothed them back into balls, and returned them to the bin. That night, I lay awake mapping the timeline. The transfers began 4 months after the shop opened, long before any divorce talk. I compared the transaction codes. ACH credits to an offshore bank, classic signs of money laundering or concealment. The next escalation came when the garbage disposal jammed. Tanya was in a panic because a plumber's visit would cost money she apparently didn't have, and Marcus just stood in the kitchen holding a flashlight while the sink filled with murky water. I shuffled in, still playing the confused old woman, and said I used to fix things like this when Daniel was alive. Tanya rolled her eyes, but let me try. I knelt under the sink, my nurse's hands steady, and I used a hex wrench from the utility drawer to manually rotate the disposal's flywheel until it broke free. It took me 3 minutes. Tanya stared at me like she'd never seen anyone use a tool before. That moment was the first crack in their illusion of my helplessness, but I covered it quickly by wincing and claiming my back hurt, retreating to my room. They never once questioned why a woman supposedly losing her cognitive abilities could still fix garbage disposals. That small incident stayed with me, a reminder that competence is a quiet weapon. The real break came when I got into the filing cabinet. I'd noticed a 2-drawer lateral cabinet in the walk-in closet off the master bedroom, secured with a cheap wafer lock. My toiletry kit still held my old hemostat, a surgical clamp I'd kept for sentimental reasons, and I knew from years of handling delicate equipment that its fine, tapered tip could work as a tension wrench. One afternoon, while Tanya was at a showing and Marcus was at the gym, I knelt in front of the cabinet, inserted the hemostat into the keyway, applied light rotational torque, and used a hairpin to rake the tumblers. The lock was rudimentary, a single wafer stack with no security pins. After 22 minutes of careful manipulation, feeling each wafer click into place through the feedback in my fingertips, The cylinder turned with a click I felt in my molars. My hands didn't shake because my nurse's training had taught me to treat every procedure as a checklist, and I ran through the steps in my head. Apply torque, feel the binding pin, rake, release, repeat. When the drawer slid open, I found a manila folder labeled B&V Dissolution. Inside were bank statements that showed the business account had been drained over 6 months through a series of structured transfers into a numbered account at an offshore bank in the Caymans. There were forged loan applications bearing my signature, a signature that was close but wrong in exactly 2 places. The loop of the E was too round, and the cross on the T was a hair too low. I knew my own handwriting like a heartbeat, and I stared at the forgery for a full minute, cataloging the errors. My E was always a sharp horizontal oval, never a perfect circle, and my T cross always intersected the stem at a 45-degree angle. The forger had drawn a 90-degree cross, something I'd never done. Behind that folder was another, thicker one labeled Estate Trust, with pages of correspondence between Tanya and an attorney, exploring every possible loophole to trigger a trust distribution without my consent. They had tried to have me declared incompetent. They had submitted a power of attorney that was rejected because it wasn't properly notarized. And they had even asked whether a durable power of attorney could survive my death, which legally it cannot, but they were desperate enough to document the attempt. I photographed every page with my phone, returned the files exactly as I'd found them, and spent the next hour sitting on the guest bed, letting the anger crystallize into a meticulous plan. That same afternoon, I noticed another clue. Tanya had tossed a letter from Northern Federal Trust into the kitchen recycling, and I retrieved it before the truck arrived. The letter was addressed to her, not to me, and it referenced a trust inquiry and a beneficiary verification hold. A compliance officer named Patricia Rourke had signed it, with a direct phone number. I folded the letter, tucked it into my coat lining, and realized that the trust Daniel had built was already pushing back against them. I bought a burner phone from a drugstore 2 days later, paying cash and hiding it inside an empty tampon box in my bathroom. From the burner, I called Patricia Rourke, identifying myself as Alina Pelham and giving just enough detail to prove I was the actual beneficiary. I told her about the letter I found, and she paused. "Mrs. Pelham, we've been trying to reach you for months. Your daughter-in-law submitted documents claiming you were incapacitated. We flagged the attempt and froze the account per our compliance protocols. We need you to come in person to verify your identity and status. But I have to warn you, there are red flags all over this file." She hesitated, and I could hear her clicking through screens. "The forgeries are bad enough, but the pattern suggests elder financial abuse. If what I'm seeing is accurate, I'm obligated to file a suspicious activity report with FinCEN and involve federal investigators." That's when I learned the full brilliance of Daniel's dead man's switch. Patricia explained that the trust was structured as a qualified terminable interest property trust, a Q-tip, with a non-identical beneficiary clause and a survivorship condition tied to my physical presence. In plain English, it meant that the principal was accessible only during my lifetime, and any attempt to access it without my express, competent consent would trigger a compliance review and an automatic freeze. If I died under suspicious circumstances, the freeze became permanent, and the funds automatically converted to a charitable remainder to a medical research foundation. My presence and my willing participation, confirmed by a live fingerprint scan and a witnessed wet ink signature at their branch, were the only keys. They had accidentally built a cage around themselves, and all I had to do was refuse to unlock it. Patricia said the bank had already recorded 2 fraudulent attempts to submit a power of attorney and a forged competency certification. She then gave me the direct line of a postal inspector, Agent Keith Morrison, who specialized in wire fraud and elder exploitation. I spoke with Agent Morrison that evening from the burner phone, crouched in the bathroom with the fan running. I told him what I'd found in the filing cabinet, shared the photographs via a secure email I'd set up at the library during a doctor's appointment, and he confirmed they were building a parallel case. He explained that wire fraud charges require an interstate communication, and the offshore transfers plus the forged documents sent across state lines gave them federal jurisdiction. He needed one more thing, he said, something that would prove intent beyond the documents, a recorded attempt to coerce me in real time, or a demonstration of their disregard for my well-being. He couldn't legally record a conversation without consent in our state, but he could use my testimony and any witnesses. I told him I had a way to test their humanity, and I'd call him right after. The maximum cruelty beat came on a Thursday morning, about 3 weeks after I moved in. I'd been meticulously gathering evidence and had confirmed with my neurologist, in a private call from the library, that my medical records already reflected a history of transient ischemic attacks, mini strokes that left me dizzy and weak. That history made a staged episode entirely plausible. I decided to force a final test. At 10 in the morning, while Tanya was at the kitchen table scrolling through listings and Marcus was on the couch, I stood up from my chair, clutched my left arm, and collapsed onto the living room rug with a sound that was only partly theater. I lay there, eyes half closed, breathing shallow, and I watched Tanya's reaction in the reflection of the glass coffee table. She didn't flinch. She didn't call 911. She walked over to where I lay, stepped directly over my outstretched hand, and grabbed a document folder off the end table without a single glance at my face. That folder, which I had deliberately placed there the night before, contained a copy of the original trust agreement. "Marcus," she said, her voice flat and impatient, "help me find the original trust paperwork. She's probably faking, but if she's not, we need to move before she's declared incompetent at the bank." Marcus hovered in the doorway, his face pale, and I saw the conflict there, a ghost of the boy I raised. For 3 full seconds, he didn't move. I counted them. 1, 2, 3. Then he walked past me to the office, and I heard a filing drawer open. That was the moment my maternal heart calcified into something entirely new, something cold and precise and absolutely certain. I recovered a few minutes later, and I told them I thought it was just a dizzy spell. Tanya didn't bother to ask if I was okay. She was too busy scanning through pages, muttering about trust provisions and statutory timelines. I went to my room, closed the door, and called Agent Morrison from the burner phone. "They just stepped over my body," I said, my voice flat. "I'll be at the branch Friday afternoon at 2 o'clock. Have your people ready." He said they'd coordinate with Patricia and uniformed officers, and that Tanya was about to walk into a federal beef. The confrontation happened at the Spring Valley branch of Northern Federal Trust, a squat brick building with too much air conditioning, and a conference room that smelled like stale coffee and old carpet glue. Tanya had orchestrated the entire thing, supposedly to straighten out the paperwork. She and Marcus drove me there under the pretense of a routine family meeting, Tanya chatting about a new listing, while Marcus stared out the window. I let them believe I was finally compliant, my hands folded in my lap, my eyes vacant. We were escorted to a small office with a wooden table and 4 chairs, and a notary was already standing by, a young woman with a kind face and a badge that read "Witness, Bank Employee." Tanya slid a thick stack of documents in front of me, her manicured nail tapping the signature line. "Sign these, Alina," she said, her voice dripping with fake warmth, "and everything goes back to normal. The trust pays out, the creditors go away, and you never have to worry about money again." The documents included a certification of competence, a release of trust principal, a general power of attorney, and a quitclaim deed for the condo in which I was supposedly acknowledging a debt I owed them. It was a masterpiece of legal manipulation, drafted by the same attorney who had written those desperate letters. I picked up the pen and felt the weight of it. The room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioner. Then I set it down and looked directly at the notary. "I'm not signing anything," I said, my voice clear and steady for the first time in weeks. "And I'd like to report an ongoing fraud conspiracy." Tanya's face went through a remarkable series of expressions: confusion, irritation, then a dawning horror as she realized the notary had pressed a button on the desk, and the door opened to admit Patricia Rourke, Agent Keith Morrison in a plain gray suit, and 2 uniformed officers. Marcus backed against the wall, his mouth opening and closing, and I saw, finally, the scared little boy he'd always been underneath. "Mom, please," he started, but I held up my hand. Agent Morrison stepped forward and identified himself, then read Tanya her rights for forgery of financial instruments, wire fraud, and elder financial abuse under state and federal statutes. He told her that her laptop and the filing cabinet in the condo had already been searched pursuant to a warrant issued that morning, based on the photographs and bank records I'd provided. They had found the offshore account numbers, the burner email she used to communicate with a document forger, and a file labeled Plan C, Guardianship Fraud. Tanya's composure shattered into screaming accusations about my mental state, but the officer's handcuffs clicked into place anyway. Marcus was detained and questioned, but not arrested that day, though he would later plead to conspiracy to commit fraud in exchange for testimony against Tanya. I watched them lead her out, and then I sat back down, because my legs were shaking and I needed a minute to breathe. Patricia brought me a cup of water and told me the trust was safe, the freeze would be lifted, and I was finally, irrevocably, free of their grip. The aftermath unfolded over the next 18 months with the slow, grinding precision of a legal millstone. Tanya's criminal trial was a white-collar spectacle. I testified for 3 hours, walking the jury through every forged document, every bank statement, every transcribed phone call. I demonstrated on an evidence pad how my E-loop was shaped versus the forgery, and a forensic document examiner corroborated the differences. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Tanya was convicted on 3 counts of forgery, 2 counts of wire fraud, and 1 count of elder financial abuse. At sentencing, I read a victim impact statement in which I described not just the financial damage, but the betrayal of a woman I had welcomed into my family. The judge sentenced her to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release, and the court ordered restitution of $180,000, representing the funds she had directly diverted plus the fraudulently obtained loan amounts. But I didn't stop there. With the criminal conviction as a foundation, I hired a civil attorney and filed a suit for conversion, breach of fiduciary duty, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We engaged a forensic accountant who reconstructed Bloom and Vine's true financial history, tracing every dollar from my initial investment to its eventual disappearance. She found that Tanya had used the shop's merchant account to process fake transactions, then reversed them and transferred the credits to her personal account. She had also taken out a $50,000 merchant cash advance using my forged signature, a high-interest product that had ballooned to nearly $90,000 with penalties. The evidence was so overwhelming that Tanya's own attorney advised her to settle before a trial destroyed her remaining assets. The judgment entered against her was for $210,000, reflecting the stolen capital, the lost business valuation, and statutory treble damages for financial exploitation of an elder under our state civil code. Collecting that judgment became its own procedural battle, and I treated it like a clinical challenge. Tanya's real estate license was still active because the commission hadn't yet been notified of the conviction, and her broker was unaware she was a convicted felon. As soon as the criminal verdict was entered, I registered the judgment with the county clerk and obtained a writ of garnishment. I served the writ directly on her employing brokerage, a high-end firm that handled luxury lakefront properties with average commissions of $20,000 to $30,000 per sale. The writ immediately intercepted every commission check, every referral fee, every bonus that would have gone to Tanya. For 11 months, I received irregular deposits ranging from $800 to $4,000, each one a small vindication. The judgment earned statutory interest at 10% per annum, compounded monthly, and I tracked every cent in a spreadsheet, cross-referencing each deposit against the brokerage's commission statements. By the time the full amount was satisfied, she had paid me back every single penny of principal plus a little over $11,000 in interest. The last deposit was for $823, and I marked it with a single red check mark and closed the file. I asked my attorney to file a satisfaction of judgment with the court, and I made a copy for my own records, a document I still keep in the drawer next to Daniel's letter. But the final thread was the one I pulled myself. I made 3 copies of the complete court transcripts, the judgment order, the criminal conviction records, and the investigative report from the postal inspector. I sent one to the state's Real Estate Commission with a detailed complaint alleging ethical violations, specifically fraudulent handling of client funds and moral turpitude. I sent the second to the National Association of Realtors, citing their Code of Ethics Articles 1 and 3 regarding honesty and cooperation with investigations. And I sent the third, with a brief cover letter, to the luxury condo developer who had hired Tanya after her release, a firm that specialized in downtown high-rises and marketed integrity as a core value. The letter simply said, Your newest agent stole my retirement and forged my signature on loans. The attached documents prove it. I thought you should know. 2 weeks later, the commission held an emergency hearing and permanently revoked her license, citing conduct demonstrating dishonesty and moral turpitude. The brokerage terminated her the next day for non-disclosure of a material conviction, and her name was removed from the state's licensing database. Her career in real estate was over, and with it, any chance of rebuilding her image. I used a portion of the recouped funds to pay off the lingering business debts that Tanya had buried under the LLC, including the predatory merchant cash advance that had been haunting my credit. I reopened the florist shop under my own name, calling it Daniel's. I'd learned enough about the industry in those painful months to run it myself, and I hired a young Korean designer named Jin, who had worked at Bloom and Vine and had been horrified to learn what happened. We do modest wedding work now, seasonal porch pots, and I sit in the back office where I've framed Daniel's cigar box and the letter underneath it. Jin doesn't know the full story, but sometimes she catches me staring at the frame and doesn't ask. Marcus and I are estranged. He wrote me a long apology from his probation officer's office, detailing his guilt and his therapy, and I read it 3 times. But I didn't reply. Grief and forgiveness are 2 separate rooms, and I'm not ready to open that door yet. Maybe one day. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't the money left behind. It's the quiet wisdom of someone who loved you enough to build a fortress around your future before you even knew you'd need one. Daniel saw the cracks in our son's character years before I did, and he gave me the tool to survive the betrayal. I just had to be brave enough to use it, and brave enough to acknowledge that the family I thought I had was a fiction written in forged ink. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? If this story resonated with you, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more true stories of family betrayal and calculated justice. Trust your instincts and keep your boundaries strong. I'll see you in the next one.